Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host Daniel Aaron Levy. Today's episode is what actually is capitalism, and it's actually the second episode of a special. And the special on this channel is an objective guide to political ideologies, but don't worry, you don't need to watch the first episode to understand and enjoy this one. You can just watch it by itself. It would clear some things up. It would perhaps optimize the viewing experience if you watch the previous episode, which is episode 9, but you don't have to do that. And if in fact you wanted to be really in the know, you could also watch episode 8, which is what the left wing and right wing actually mean. But you don't need to do that. You can just enjoy this by itself. And so this episode, what actually is capitalism? We're going to be using political science and economics here to find what it actually is. And then if we have time, which I imagine we will, but I'm just giving a little disclaimer in case we don't, we're going to be talking about what forms capitalism can take and what actually works. And in case you can't tell, I am quite caffeinated at the moment, so that should be fun. Anyway, let's get into it. So, the political science / economics definition of capitalism is, drumroll please, an economic system where the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. Now let's break that down because that might sound a little bit opaque. So first of all, the means of production. What actually is the means of production? Now, means of production is a term that we see a lot associated with Marxism. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with rise up, seize the means of production, these kind of phrases. And it's true that the idea of the means of production is really central to Marxian theory. But the idea of means of production isn't a communist concept. It's just a general economics concept, which Marx talks about a lot. Marx was, by the way, an economist. So it does make sense. The means of production is basically just, as the name suggests, how stuff gets made in a society. And it can be thought of as three components: labor, the instruments of labor, and the subjects of labor. So the instruments of labor is stuff like tools, machines, factories, infrastructure, restaurants, burger joints, corner shops, supermarkets. The subjects of labor is stuff like land, natural resources, and raw materials. Basically, the means of production is a term that describes how goods get made, and it involves labor acting on the subjects of labor using the instruments of labor to produce goods or services. That's all it really means. Sometimes you get the means of production as defined by the three factors of production, and the three factors of production are land, labor, and capital. Capital is a very general term for just resources in general. So you'll actually often see the word capital cropping up in lots of different academic disciplines. In this case, in the context of the means of production, capital refers to something called capital goods. And a capital good is a good that is needed to produce more goods. Basically, as a simplified definition, that's basically what it is. So a capital good is something like machinery, or steel, or railways, stuff like that. Whereas a consumer good is something that is used by a consumer for their own purposes. So, for example, a watch, or a laptop, or a notebook, or a packet of gum, or whatever, stuff like that. Now, sometimes the means of production also includes infrastructure. And that's because the means of production often colloquially, not technically, but the way that it's used by people in everyday speech often includes the means of distribution, which is how goods are just sent from the center of production to consumers or to the relevant targets. So stores, infrastructure, the internet, those are all means of distribution. Now, the means of production in a knowledge economy, i.e., what actually is a knowledge economy? Well, I'm glad you asked. A knowledge economy is basically when the subjects of labor, rather than being just natural resources, raw materials, land, are also intangible knowledge-based things like, for example, ideas, information, practices, and where the workings of the economy and the production of goods and services is dependent on intangible things like skills, learning, research, innovation, ideas. So, for example, in a service-based economy, perhaps, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the term post-industrial economy, but it describes most of the economies in the West now, where most of the economic activity in the economy isn't manufacturing goods, but rather providing services. And in that kind of economy, lots of what's very important in that economy isn't just raw materials and physical things, but also the skills and knowledge of workers. Also, scientific or technical industries can be described as contributing to a knowledge economy because they require knowledge and intellectual capital. in order to function. So the means of production in a knowledge economy include stuff like learning, research, innovation, ideas, etc. So that's what means of production is defined as. Let's return to our definition. An economic system wherein the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. Owned privately basically means they're owned not by the state or some state-backed corporation, but rather by individuals and firms acting in their own economic self-interest. We'll get a little bit more the idea of private property and private ownership later. That's just a kind of glancing definition. Operated for profit in a market economy. That's important because the point is that the means of production are owned by individuals and firms for the point of making them a profit, rather than, for example, serving state goals such as developing the country as a whole, or ensuring equality of distribution, or ensuring maximum distribution to all members of society. Now, it's important to note that in some forms of capitalism, particular form of capitalism known as a mixed economy, and we're going to get onto that later, then in part of the economy, the means of production are owned and operated not just to make profit, but to realize national goals or government goals. But mostly in what characterizes a capitalist economy is that even though there may be some degree of state ownership of the means of production or some degree of use of the means of production for the achievement of state goals or national goals or whatever, most of the time in that country, for the majority of that economy, the means of production are owned privately and operated to make a profit for the individual or the firm operating the means of production. Now, let's break down the final term of that definition. Remember, an economic system wherein the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. What is a market economy? A market economy fundamentally is a resource allocation mechanism. It basically determines which economic bodies or which economic actors get what. The opposite of a market economy is known as is an economic distribution mechanism or allocation mechanism known as planning, where basically some body, either a centralized body, so for example the state, or decentralized bodies, for example different autonomous economic units, decide which economic actors, what bodies, what firms, what organizations get what resources. But a market economy is a resource allocation mechanism that's the opposite of planning. And in a market economy, the decisions on production and distribution, i.e. what gets produced and how what produced gets distributed, these decisions are made according to economic rules of supply and demand. So they're determined by market forces. And these decisions are made largely by individuals or firms. Firms as in companies. Rather than, for example, a state or an organization of a state or a commune or some kind of national body or a workers' council. So capitalism is a subset of market economy. A market economy is in fact a very large umbrella term describing lots and lots of different economic policies, all united by having this resource allocation mechanism. Some forms of socialism use a market economy as well. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, market economy is a circle and capitalism is a circle within that larger circle of market economy. Now, in the economic system of capitalism, just returning to further defining capitalism and further giving an idea of what capitalism is, the aim of production, the point of making things, is to act in self-interest to accumulate capital. What does that mean? It basically means that the purpose of making things is not for some greater good of society, or to reach state goals, or to fulfill some kind of directive from the government, or to achieve any kind of social goal or social justice. The aim of production is for the person, the individual or the firm operating the means of production to act in their own self-interest to accumulate capital. Capital, again, I defined it as kind of meaning resources in a very large sense, and capital can be stuff like money. It can be stuff like financial assets, such as bonds or stocks or securities. It can be physical goods, such as capital goods. It can be physical goods that aren't capital goods. It can be consumer goods, for example. So like, I don't know, watches or laptops or electronics or bits of technology or beds or chairs or furniture, etc., etc., etc. Capital can also be intangible resources, stuff like education or skills or ideas or research, etc., etc. Capital in a really broad sense is just stuff. And the aim of production is to gain stuff. And in capital, goods are produced for exchange value and not use value. What does that mean? It basically means that in capital, in the system of capitalism, whenever something is manufactured, let's say in a factory, the point of that, consumer goods are often manufactured for use value, i.e. for the inherent good of using them. But most of the time in capitalism, stuff isn't made for the purpose of using it and consuming it immediately. It's made for the purpose of exchanging it with something else. Let me give an example of that. A classic example is housing. So, right now the UK is in a bit of a housing crisis, but there will still be many houses in the UK which have been abandoned by their landlords and are just sort of rotting or deteriorating. And that's because these houses are not produced necessarily for their use value. They're not produced for the purpose of people living in them, per se. They're produced in order for people to live in them and to therefore pay rent. I.e., the point of making the house is that the value of the house, as created by or operated by the landlord or the house manufacturer or whatever, can be exchanged for the commodity of rent. The point of the house isn't for, let's say, the homeless people in the country to fill that house. I.e., the house is not being made directly for its value and being used. The point of making that house is so that the use of that house can be exchanged for the commodity of rent, i.e. a payment for living in that house. I hope that makes sense. Basically, the point I'm trying to say is that instead of fulfilling a social good, it fulfills a market purpose. I hope that makes sense. Goods in capitalism are mainly made by the system of wage labor the labor is usually done by individuals who can freely organize the disposal of their own labor. So, for example, wage labor is just some person performs labor for an hour and is therefore paid in money for the labor of that hour. Obviously, many people in economies are paid by salaries, but that's kind of just an extension of wage labor in that you work for a year or a month rather and are paid for the labor of that month. This is opposed to other economic systems, such as seen in medieval Europe, where medieval peasants would work not for money, but because they'd sworn an oath of fealty to their lord in order to provide labor services, and in return, they would get certain other services, such as judicial arbitration or protection from invaders and other lords. The idea is that in a system of feudalism in medieval Europe, just to return for that example, because it is the dominant economic system that preceded capitalism in the Western world. To return to feudalism, the manufacture of goods and the kind of exchange of economic services and labor services is based on ideas of vassalage and fealty and owing services and duty, rather than just a free market transaction between free individuals. It's also worth noting that the vast majority of common people in medieval Europe were not legally free. They could not freely dispose of their own labor. They were bound to working their land. They could not leave that land or stop working in that land. They were forced to live there and work for their lord. In fact, in Tsarist Russia, so Russia ruled by the Tsars, what could even happen is if a lord sold some land to another lord, all the peasants or serfs bound to that land would go with them. So if you're a peasant in Russia bound to a certain spot of land and that land changes ownership, the person who now owns that land can cart you off to wherever they choose that they own. So as a medieval peasant, you can literally just be torn from your families simply by the changing of hands of the land that you own because you'd pass into the ownership of another lord. In capitalism, most of the time, individuals are free to organize their own labor. Now, various socialists or leftists of different stripes, and especially Marx, all his followers, would say that in capitalism, workers aren't actually free because they're forced to work in order to simply survive, and they don't get the profits of their own labor. They may be politically free. They may technically have the right to up and quit work and choose to do something else, but in practice, they can't actually do that because they're reliant on these jobs in order to just survive. And the balance of power between the employer and the employee is extremely uneven because the employer needs the employee a lot less than the other way around. But we're going to be getting onto criticisms of capitalism later, and especially in subsequent episodes. So, for example, what actually is socialism or communism or anarchism? In this, I really want to just define capitalism. So in capitalism, individuals can, legally at least, freely organize and dispose of their own labor. Another feature of capitalism is that intangible or freely available goods tend to get commodified. What do I mean by this? Stuff like land, sex, access to nature, holidays, services, information, intangible goods that could potentially be freely available to everyone become a marketable property that can be bought, sold, and its use restricted. Quite a big example of this is the fact that you have to pay to see Stonehenge in the UK. That's a really classic example of the commodification of the English landscape, i.e. something like Stonehenge, which is, it's not intangible in this case, but it's freely available, it's there, becomes an economic thing that can be bought or sold and can be turned into a commodity to be sold and placed on a market economy. Another example of something that gets commodified in the system of capitalism is animals. So for example, in the system of capitalism, animals can be bought and sold. Their labor can be bought or sold. They're raised for livestock. They're used to herd animals. They're raised for wool or milk or other products. They can be used to move vehicles or push plows. They can be used for tourism or a means of transport, etc., etc. The point is that something like an animal, which is just a freely available, naturally occurring thing, is, by the means of capitalism, placed on the market economy and can be bought, sold, distributed, etc. The same thing applies with humans in the system of slavery. Something which is not intangible, but a naturally occurring thing which should be freely accessible to all, can be turned into property, and therefore the utilization of that person, i.e. utilization of that slave, restricted to the owner of that piece of property. Now, property is a very important concept in capitalism. In fact, the central concept of capitalism is the idea of private property. Now, private property is distinct from personal property. So economic systems like socialism, communism, and anarchism allow for individuals to own personal property. And personal property is just the ownership of consumer goods. So, for example, a common criticism of socialism is that you'd have to share your toothbrush with someone. That's just factually incorrect, because a toothbrush is an idea of personal property and it's not held in common with anyone. It can just be owned by you exclusively as an individual. So stuff like a piece of gum, your clothes, a decorative chain, nose drops, your fan, bedding, a laptop, a water bottle, I'm just naming stuff around me, a plug. All of this is personal property because it's used by you. Private property refers to some kind of means of production. So land, or a factory, or railways, or ports, all this is classed under private property. It is the ownership of a thing which is used for making other things in some way. That could be land, it could be labor, it could be capital goods, or producer goods. Producer goods as just goods that you need to make more goods. For example, machinery, it's a kind of capital good. Or is it synonymous with capital good? Let me double check that. I'm going to pause this. Okay, I just checked. Producer goods is an umbrella category that involves capital goods, land, and labor. But also including the category of capital goods is stuff like buildings or machinery or a coal mine. So private property is, let's say you own a coal mine. That is private property, not personal property, because you're using a coal mine to make stuff. You're using that. It's something that takes part in the economy. Whereas if I just gave you a lump of coal, which would be a really weird gift, but let's say I just gave you a lump of coal for your own use in heating up your home. Yeah, actually, that's not such a weird gift. That's just fuel, really, isn't it? Well, I mean, I'm not using coal to heat up my home. Okay, this is all a tangent. The point is, if I gave you a lump of coal to use as fuel, that's a consumer good. If I give you a coal mine, that's a producer good, or a capital good, rather, because it's a form of private property. It's a form of the means of production. So a coal mine is counted under private property. A lump of coal is counted under personal property. And the central concept of capitalism is the ability to own private property and the inviolability of that. The government can't just take your private property without any kind of pretense. Now, in practice, in various forms of capitalism, the government can confiscate private property with quite a bit of ease. But the point is that at least nominally, private property is respected. It's not completely arbitrary. Now, private property in capitalism can be sold or lent. Indeed, personal property can also be sold or lent to others, and others may buy or borrow private property or personal property without the explicit permission from the state and independent of the state. This, in practice, varies quite a lot based on the system of capitalism. Capitalism is a very massive umbrella term with lots of different varieties, but a basic idea in capitalism is that if I have a thing, I can sell that thing or lend that thing, and you can choose to buy or borrow that thing. And in order to complete that transaction, that doesn't necessarily in some industries and for some goods that may require permission from the state. For example, if I'm selling you a nuclear warhead, I imagine the government's going to want to get involved in some way. But let's say I'm just selling you a piece of blue tack. The government doesn't need to get involved in that. I don't need permission to do that. I'm allowed to freely do that. That unplanned situation of people buying and selling is, in economics, a market. And it's based on economic forces such as supply and demand. Now, a key concept in capitalism is the idea of competition. There may be many people selling the same or a similar good and service, and they all compete with each other. And by the mechanism of competition, that's really essential to keeping capitalism afloat and keeping a market healthy. Now, in practice, you often get a situation of imperfect competition, where rather than there being a perfect state of competition in the economy, where you have lots of firms, they all sell the exact same good or service, and they're all competing with each other, in practice, that situation gets muddied by a host of real-life factors. Basically, in economics models, you get a state of perfect competition. In real life, you get imperfect competition, where, for example, some companies might have a slight edge due to their location or their specific brand or some kind of prestige associated with it, or some kind of difference in the way that good or service is produced, or some kind of feature of the market. So, for example, something like railways or water infrastructure, that's really, really expensive to set up. The point being that if you're a company, it's really hard to get into that market. So only a few economic actors and companies will be able to get into that market. And once a few companies get into that market, companies or corporations can snowball and get bigger and bigger and bigger and outcompete smaller firms until in a certain industry, they're the only company left in that industry. And that is known as a monopoly. A monopoly is when, so in some kind of industry or field, there's only one company available. Examples of monopolies, so monopolies can be total or regional. I think the total monopoly, I don't think is an actual economic term. I'm just kind of using that for your own convenience, but a regional monopoly is an actual economic term. So an example is the fact that in the area that I live in, Great Western Railway has in effect a regional monopoly over railways there. There are other railways operating, so it's not technically a regional monopoly that they have, but in practice it is. And as many people who use Great Western Railway can attest, that's not really good for consumers, because if there's not much competition, then Great Western Railway, to use this example, can just jack up their prices, and there's not really much that you, a consumer, can do about that. And it's not a coincidence that that's happened in railways, because it's so difficult to build railways and actually build trains and operate them that it's really hard to get into that market, which means that competition is very difficult. And it's a reason why historically industries like the railways or water infrastructure have been nationalized, because otherwise you get a state of imperfect competition that leads to monopolies, or at the very least oligopolies, which is when a few companies dominate an industry rather than just one. And that leads to difficulties for the consumer because they can just jack up their prices or provide poor services, and there's nothing really much you can do about it because you have no other options. Now, there is a lot more to the economic concept of imperfect competition than just monopolies and oligopolies. I'm just giving an example, and it's especially important to point out because capitalism often leads to those kinds of phenomena. We especially saw that historically in the period from around the 1870s to around the early 1900s, where a few companies, for example, Standard Oil in the USA, were able to accumulate lots and lots of capital and kind of snowball and get larger and larger and outcompete their competitors and establish monopolies or oligopolies at the expense of the consumer. The result of which being in the early 1900s, there was lots of legislation and effort to kind of help deal with monopolies. An example would be the actions of President Theodore Roosevelt in breaking up monopolies by antitrust acts. A trust, by the way, is, I believe, like a very large corporation. Let me look that up. Let me look up the definition of a trust. So a trust is like a monopoly, basically. By the way, many countries, the idea in jurisprudence of competition law is, I'm losing my train of thought. Competition law is a kind of field of law which is all about maintaining more competition in a market economy by, for example, helping break up monopolies and oligopolies. Because capitalism has a tendency, when unregulated, to tend towards a few really large economic actors snowballing and getting larger and larger and consolidating their gains and therefore undermining competition. That's a bit of a tangent on the idea of market competition. And in fact, I'm probably going to get into that more in future episodes dedicated to economics. It's just something that's worth mentioning in when we're discussing capitalism. But again, within these boundaries of what I've just described, capitalism can take on many, many forms. Capitalism is a huge umbrella term. It's an economic system characterized by a few basic things, which I've just discussed, plus a little tangent on competition, although in practice, the vast majority of countries have some laws nowadays to maintain competition, although the stringency of these laws and the intrusiveness of these laws in the market economy will vary quite a lot based on the form of capitalism. The point I'm trying to say is that capitalism has many forms. Now, capitalism itself, as we've just stated, is an economic system. And that's relevant because this series really is a guide to political ideologies. But capitalism is not actually an ideology. What do we mean by that? Now, an ideology, you'll find a million definitions of ideology online. Essentially, it's a form of beliefs, views, and practices. And for the sake of this series, I've defined an ideology as having three components. And I've made that definition because I feel it provides a synthesis of the available information and definitions of what an ideology is. And it's a synthesis which is tailor-made to what we're going to be talking about in this podcast to be as informative but as accessible as possible. So this definition of an ideology isn't something official. It's a personal synthesis of mine, but it's a personal synthesis of mine that's based on real research and real scholarship, and that is handmade and kind of tailor-made to be as understandable but as informative for you guys as possible. And the three components of an ideology as defined in this series are political, economic, and socio-cultural. Political is stuff like, how is political power used and distributed? What is the nature of it? Who gets it? What can be done with it? The second component of an ideology is economic. How does the economy work? The third component of an ideology is socio-cultural. So what values does society hold? What's the aim of society? So not just stuff like what are your stances on social issues like LGBT rights or racism or feminism, but also in a much deeper sense, what are the ethical ideas that your society holds? What is the point of civilization? What are we aiming for? Now, in these three components of ideology, capitalism meets one, the economic form, because it's an economic system, but capitalism isn't a political system of thought or a socio-cultural system of thought. That is to say, capitalism is an economic system, not a socio-political system, which means that capitalism can be allied and used with lots of different socio-political systems, ranging from social democracy on the left end to fascism on the right end. These are wildly different in their ideas on how political power should be used and what socio-cultural values should be held. Now, of course, capitalism isn't compatible with all socio-political ideologies. So, for example, the ideology of communism has a social element, a political element, and an economic element. And the economic element of the communist ideology is completely incompatible with the economic system of capitalism. Indeed, as you probably know, the economic system and the ideology of communism explicitly rejects the economic system of capitalism. So capitalism isn't applicable to all socio-political systems. The point is, any social political system which fits into the wide, broad umbrella that is capitalism can be allied with capitalism. But in practice, even though capitalism can be allied with a huge range of socio-political systems in its many different forms, including fascism, capitalism evolved with, and usually occurs with, nowadays, the socio-political system of liberalism. Now, liberalism is something that we discuss quite in depth in episode 9, which is why I said at the start of the episode that it would be really useful for you guys to go back and see that, but you don't have to do that. Just as a brief explanation of what liberalism is a socio-political system wherein the aim of civilization is an association of free and equal individuals. That is the point of civilization. And in liberalism, truth, humanity, the restraint of violence, and reason are seen as inherently good things. Now, the definitions of freedom and equality vary massively based on the kind of liberalism, because just like capitalism, liberalism as a socio-political system is a really, really wide wide umbrella term. But liberalism broadly believes in the idea of a rule of law, i.e., all people in society, even a monarch, still have to obey the law. They don't live above it. They can't do whatever they want in spite of it. Liberalism tends to invoke and involve the concept of private property and the inviolability of private property and the importance of it. Liberalism tends to involve consent of the governed, i.e., the people in a state should consent to the way that their state is governed. They shouldn't just be told exactly what to do in a form of tyranny. In practice, based on the interpretation of liberalism, the number and proportion of people in society whose consent actually matters has varied quite considerably, but it is still a political principle. Liberalism also believes in political equality and rights. So everyone is nominally politically equal in that they have the ability to do whatever they want. They're not legally unfree or legally prevented from rising up the social scale. They also have civil liberties, such as the freedom of speech, freedom to organize in associations or unions or whatever, freedom to say whatever they want about the government, freedom of religion as well. And another key concept of liberalism is secularism, the idea that religion shouldn't be involved in how a country is run, and that while religion can be influential privately, it shouldn't be a point in state governance. That is a whistle-stop tour of the very basics of the socio-political system of liberalism. And capitalism historically has emerged and evolved in its modern form with the idea of liberalism. So capitalism emerged, it kind of gradually started forming in the early modern era, which is a stretch of history defined as lasting between 1453 and 1789. What's so special about those dates? 1453 is when the Eastern Roman Empire fell, 1789 was the French Revolution. And capitalism became the dominant economic system in the long 19th century, which is another historical term referring from 1789 to 1914. So that's the French Revolution to the outbreak of World War I. And in the long 19th century, capitalism emerged as a dominant economic system, and it was allied to the socio-political system of classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism is a term that we talk about quite at length in, for example, I don't know why I said for example. I just lost my train of thought there. Just using words to buy me some time, I guess. It's a system that we discussed a lot in the previous episode, in episode 9. Classical liberalism is basically an interpretation of liberalism, and it emphasizes massive economic freedom, i.e. no government intervention or regulation in the economy, except to uphold the system itself from some kind of threat. So for example, the example I used last time was in 1871 in France, in Paris, a commune was set up. So a system of government that wasn't explicitly capitalist, and capitalists in France supported armed intervention of the government to destroy the Paris Commune. That is permitted in the system of classical liberalism because it's to uphold the system of classical liberalism. But no other government regulation intervention is permitted. That, of course, comes at the expense of economic equality and social justice, but the idea in classical liberalism is that political and economic freedom is most important above all else. Political freedom is that everyone is legally free. Not that everyone in classical liberalism gets the right to vote. And in fact, in the system of classical liberalism that developed in the long 19th century, not everyone did have the right to vote. There wasn't universal suffrage. The ability to vote was based on a property qualification, i.e. having a certain amount of wealth. However, the idea is that if anyone in society could accumulate that amount of wealth and thus gain the right to vote, the right to vote isn't barred based on hereditary privilege. It's not that you have to be born to an aristocrat or a gentleman to have the right to vote. In that sense, therefore, there is political equality because everyone has the legal ability to rise to the top of the social scale. No one is legally unfree. And then there's the idea of economic equality. The government doesn't intervene in the economy to, for example, meet welfare, for example, establish a welfare state or to meet state goals or to develop the country as a whole, except for a very limited extent and with some limited regulation. The point is that generally in classical liberalism, even if there may be some exceptions, the government stays out of the economy and the economy works in order to allow capitalistic individuals and firms to accumulate capital and property rather than to meet state goals. The point in classical liberalism is that the government stays out. It's all about profit and accumulating capital and commodification. That's the social political ideology that developed concurrently with capitalism. Now, after the Great Depression, which was this economic event emerging in 1929, the dominant social political system that evolved with that kind of became accompanied with capitalism in the West was that of social liberalism, which basically held that yes, political and economic freedom was still important, but the government had to intervene in the economy to some extent to provide welfare for its inhabitants, to provide social services such as unemployment relief or pensions or benefits or some other kind of social security, and had to regulate the economy to prevent it from crashing again and to prevent large amounts of economic inequality. The idea being that in social liberalism is still the dominant ideology and capitalism is still the dominant economic system, but some degree of intervention and regulation is not only justified, but inherently good, so as in order to meet the ideals of economic equality a little bit better and to prevent the largest abuses of the system and to provide some measure of welfare to its inhabitants. The idea of social liberalism is that it's not just about social economic freedom, it's also, and not just about the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of profit, it's also about running the economy to serve the social and public good in some way. So for example, by provision of education, healthcare, infrastructure, sanitation, things like that. All that is built into the system of social liberalism. Then, in the 1970s, the dominant social political system in the West that accompanied capitalism shifted again from social liberalism to neoliberalism, which is kind of a return to the classical liberal orthodoxy of the government staying out of the economy and letting the economy do its thing and letting the hand of the market do its thing, with a greater degree of regulation and intervention and welfare provision than the classical liberalism of before, however. It's not quite as unregulated as classical liberalism, but the ideas are the same. It's a return to the idea of the government shouldn't intervene in the economy, or at least it should intervene in the economy as little as possible in order to ensure stability. And whereas in social liberalism, the main form of government intervention, or rather the main purpose of the government intervention is to reduce unemployment, in neoliberalism, the main purpose of government intervention should be to reduce inflation. So the main evil in both of these socio-political systems is different. In one it's unemployment, and in one it's inflation. And all that can be understood by understanding the context in which these socio-political systems evolved. But that's really a subject for episode 9, the previous episode. We're not going to be talking about that much here because we don't have a huge amount of time. So, capitalism, while it can be allied to a large range of socio-political ideologies, and it has been. So, for example, in the 30s, while many countries operated capitalism with the socio-political system of social liberalism, many other countries operated capitalism with the socio-political system of fascism. But generally, and especially in the Western world, capitalism has tended to be associated with liberalism. Now let's answer another question. Is capitalism left or right wing? And again, conversations on what leftism and rightism actually are, are discussed more in episode 8, in an episode which is especially devoted to what left wing and right wing actually mean, but you don't need to watch that. That's okay. You can just enjoy and understand this episode without any backstory. Now, most people have an idea that capitalism is kind of in the center of the spectrum, and it can't be far left, but maybe it isn't far right as well. In reality, capitalism can range from pretty solidly left to all the way far right, because it's compatible with social-political systems ranging from social democracy, or the Nordic model, as you could also call it, to fascism, which is a very far-right social-political ideology. But how do we understand that left-right spectrum? Because in the popular consciousness, there does exist this idea of this one-dimensional spectrum, this axis of left versus right. But it's all quite confusing. I mean, it's very difficult leftism tends to be associated with stuff like freedom and equality and liberty and anti-authoritarianism and trans rights and veganism and government intervention and saying no to racism and feminism and this and that and that. And rightism tends to be associated with order and law and order and authority and hierarchy and tradition and duty and the government playing less of a role in the economy and taking less of a progressive stance, and it's associated maybe with the repeal of Roe versus Wade and Donald Trump and this and that. And it's all very confusing. These all kind of exist as this kind of massive ideas in the public mind associated with one side or another of the political spectrum. It's all quite complicated. How can we break this down? How can we untangle these many threads? There's lots of ways to do this, actually. And if you go online, you'll find lots of different ways of kind of diffracting and breaking up this one-dimensional left-right spectrum into kind of a more comprehensive, more manageable model. But the model that we use in Polymath, which again isn't some officially sanctioned model, but is based on consensus scholarship in the field, and which I think provides the best balance of being informative and accessible, and which is kind of tailor-made to the purpose of this podcast, is the idea of diffracting that one-dimensional left-right spectrum into 3 different axes. And these 3 different axes correspond really, really well, in fact, practically entirely, to the 3 different parts of ideologies which I mentioned earlier. By the way, when I say that I've tailored all these definitions to the podcast, this is what I mean. Like the alignment between the 3-way diffraction of the left-right spectrum and the 3-way diffraction of ideologies is very deliberate here. But it's not just something that I've contrived. Like, it is entirely legitimate to diffract the left-right spectrum into 3 different axes, which I'm mentioning here, and to diffract ideologies into 3 different components I've mentioned here. And it's been done by various other important political thinkers, and has been done in lots of different ways by different thinkers, and represents a kind of one of the general consensuses. Consensi? Yeah, it would be consensi, right? Yeah, consensi of these fields. It's not just something that I've plucked out of thin air, even if it's a personal synthesis of available research. So, the 3 diffractions of the left-right spectrum can be thought of based on political power and how it's used and distributed, economics and how it's run, and social-cultural values. So one axis of the left-right spectrum is libertarian versus authoritarian, i.e., how much power does the government have in the daily lives of its citizens and in the state in total. So a hyper-authoritarian state would be something like a totalitarian nation. That's one end of that axis, where the government has all powerful, all control. The other end of that spectrum is something like anarchism, where the idea of a state as we know it doesn't even exist because it's seen as too authoritarian, and people govern themselves in small, decentralized units. So that libertarian authoritarian axis is one axis of the left-right spectrum. The other axis of that spectrum is economic leftism versus economic rightism. And that the prefix economic is really important here because economic leftism is a subset of leftism in general. And basically, that's about to what degree does the government intervene in the economy. So at the furthest right end of that spectrum, at the far economic right, you have the philosophy of minarchism, which is where the government only provides an army, law courts, and a police, and that's it. At the other end of that spectrum, at the far economic left, you have a system of centralized planning could be decentralized planning. Basically, it's just a form of planning where there's no market economy at all, and decisions are made based on, and kind of production and distribution decisions are made explicitly in order to meet state goals rather than being governed by economic rules. The third axis of our left-right spectrum is socio-cultural values. And it's basically what stances do you take on social issues? And what is the aim of your civilization as a whole? So, for example, and that can be conceptualized as being progressive versus conservative. So the far progressive end on that axis would be stuff like a very progressive view on racism, feminism, trans rights, LGBT issues in general, but also very progressive stances on government and liberty and authority and the aim of civilization so as to procure liberty and equality and truth and reason and justice and humanity. At the more conservative end, we see more conservative stances on the current issues of today. So Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are conservative thinkers. At the far conservative end, we reach ideologies like fascism, which hold completely different conceptions of civilization. So, for example, fascism does not hold liberty, equality, truth, and the restraint of violence to be inherently good things. More on that in the episode that I'm going to do on what fascism actually is, and more on that in the preceding episode of episode 9. The point I'm trying to make is that social cultural axis that I've mentioned in leftism and rightism doesn't just correspond to stances on social issues. It corresponds to a much deeper view of civilization as a whole and what are the ethical values of civilization. So, where does capitalism fit on these 3 axes? Now, on the libertarian authoritarian axis, capitalism can be kind of anywhere. It's not necessarily, it can be compatible with hyper-authoritarian philosophies such as fascism, for example. It can also be compatible with very libertarian philosophies such as various different kinds of democracy as seen in liberalism. In the most ultimate libertarian philosophies such as anarchism, for example, or communism. When I say communism, I mean communism as in theory, not as it's actually occurred in practice. More on that in the communism episode. But anyway, so in the libertarian authoritarian kind of axes of the left-right spectrum, capitalism can fit pretty much anywhere apart from the far end of libertarian, right? In the progressive and conservative axis, capitalism can fit pretty much anywhere apart from the very far end of progressive, where we get philosophies such as anarchism and communism, as in theory rather than in practice, which explicitly reject capitalism for tending towards conservatism and authoritarianism. So capitalism compatible with pretty much anywhere in the libertarian authoritarian axis and in the progressive conservative axis, apart from the leftmost fringes of either. Now, in the economic left and economic right axis of the left-right spectrum, capitalism can vary massively, but it would never be a far economic left philosophy. Because in far economic left economic philosophies, we get stuff like socialism, communism, and anarchism. Capitalism is, however, very compatible with far economic right. So, for example, capitalism is compatible with the far economic right philosophy of minarchism. It's also compatible with the far economic right, but not so far economic right philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism, which when the government may do things like provide infrastructure, for example, and will have some laws beyond those three basic functions, but it still just stays out of the economy. Capitalism is also compatible with various degrees of social democracy or economic intervention. And the various different forms of social democracy and economic intervention, I think, in terms of forms of capitalism, I'm going to save for another episode because it's already been about 50 minutes so far, and I'm thinking I don't want to be rushing the different definitions of capitalism. So I'm thinking I'm going to break this down into 2 episodes. See, I thought I'd have time for this. I thought I'd have time to get into the different varieties of capitalism with more detail. But actually, rather than trying to stuff that into the remainder of this hour, I think it would be a bit better if I left that for a separate episode. So basically, just to summarize, what actually is capitalism? An objective guide. Capitalism is an economic system where the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. Within these boundaries, capitalism can vary massively. It's compatible with a huge range of different socio-political ideologies because capitalism in itself isn't a socio-political ideology. And therefore, capitalism isn't really an ideology in the proper sense. It's more of an economic system. However, capitalism is often kind of conceptualized in the public consciousness as an ideology because it's so bound up with the socio-political system of liberalism. It evolved with liberalism and tends to occur with liberalism that in fact, when people nowadays in the West think of capitalism, they tend to associate it with some form of liberalism. And that could be classical liberalism, social liberalism, and neoliberalism. Often, if you talk to someone who's quite left-wing in Bristol and they speak pejoratively of capitalism, they're probably going to be associating it with the socio-political ideology of neoliberalism. But in practice, in actuality, in the political science definition of capitalism, it doesn't necessarily need to be involved with neoliberalism at all. And if we look at the left-right spectrum and we diffract that into 3 separate axes, we can see that capitalism, based on we've said that capitalism is an economic system and it doesn't really say much or say anything rather about social cultural values or political power, which means that as you'd expect, in terms of the left-right axes, in terms of libertarian authoritarianism, capitalism is compatible with pretty much the entirety of the libertarian authoritarian axis. It's also compatible with pretty much the entirety of the progressive conservative axis, which, as we mentioned, is concerned with social cultural values. In terms of the economic left, economic right axis, capitalism takes on a bit more of a narrow range, but it still takes on quite a large range within that axis, varying from far economic right to solidly economic left. The point I'm trying to make is that is what capitalism actually is. It's this broad umbrella term, mostly defined by economic principles. In terms of the different varieties of capitalism, there have been a huge number of different varieties of capitalism, which is basically what you'd expect for such a broad umbrella term. But we're going to be getting into that next episode because I just want to give it time. I want to give it the proper attention it deserves, and I want to give you guys the most accurate and in-depth information. I don't want to feel as if I'm having to skim over things or be quick. So, that is today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed. If you've listened to the end, I am truly honored. I'm really, really honored and flattered that you guys would listen to me yap. I really hope that you guys find this informative. Even if you haven't listened to the end, even if you just tuned in for the first minute and are therefore not listening to this because by definition it's impossible, I'm still grateful to you. I'm still grateful that you're watching, you're listening. I hope you're enjoying. I really, really enjoy making these, even though it kind of kills my voice. I'm getting a little bit hoarse. I don't know if you can hear. Anyway, I hope you guys have a lovely day, and I will see you next week for the episode on the different varieties of capitalism and which of them actually work. And then after that, we'll be continuing our objective guide series by moving on to socialism, communism, anarchism, and then finally fascism. So, thank you very much again for listening, and have a lovely day.